So, Turkey purchased the Russian S400 air defense system. Now, Turkey is a sovereign nation. However, Turkey is also part of NATO. And whether this is an economic issue or whether this is a geopolitical issue, the United States had certain feelings about Turkey doing that and passed sanctions on a NATO partner because of such. Right here, the Secretary of State has, quote, the Secretary of State has determined, pursuant to the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act of 2017, that the Turkish entity Presidency of Defense Industries, formerly known as Undersecretariat for Defense Industries, has knowingly, on or after August 2nd, 2017, engaged in a significant transaction with a person that is part of or operates for, on behalf of, the defense or intelligence sector of the government of the Russian Federation. This statement added that the Secretary of State has also selected certain sanctions to be imposed upon the SSB and Ismail Demir, the SSB president's Frank's Jurgen. Basically, without going too far into the weeds, the U.S. imposed sanctions on Turkey for buying the S-400 missiles. And there's also this interesting question of Turkey being a NATO member buying those missiles in the first place. To discuss, we're having a conversation, or to have a conversation about it, we're we're discussing this with Yusuf Erim. He's editor-at-large at TRTWorld and a Turkish foreign policy expert. Yusuf, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, explain this for me from the standpoint of Turkey and the framing of the Turkish government in regards to two things: buying the S-400 missiles in the first place, which again, Turkey is a sovereign country, it can do whatever it wants. But it is interesting that a NATO nation is buying a sophisticated weapon system from Russia. So there's that part. But also, how does Turkey frame or deal with, from their standpoint, and the way that they think about this, the sanctions passed on them from the United States?
Well, it's very simple. Now, when we look at what's happened over the past decade in Turkey's neighborhood, you have the Syrian conflict, you have the Iraq conflict, you have ISIS on Turkey's borders, you have PKK, which is a Kurdish designated terror group on Turkey's borders. You have over 700 missiles which have landed on, I should say rockets, which have landed on Turkish soil over the past 10 years. Now, in 2015, the United States withdrew their Patriots from Turkey, and many of Turkey's NATO allies have also withdrawn their Patriots from Turkey as their service time had expired. So Turkey realized that it can't just count on NATO for its air defense. It needs its own air defense system that it personally owns. It tried to buy Patriots from the United States during the Obama era. That never panned out. The conditions just were not feasible. There was no technology transfer, and Turkey didn't feel confident that Congress would have approved such a sale. As over the past 2 to 3 years, we've seen that there's been a shadow ban on any type of Turkish purchase of weapons from the United States. So Turkey went first to China. The Chinese deal fell through, and afterwards, Turkey ended up reaching a deal with Russia. So it was a very logical step, a very logical chronology, a very rational chronology that led Turkey to buy the S-400. Now, as for the sanctions, well, first, Turkey has told the United States that this is going to be a standalone system. It's not going to interfere with NATO's radar, any type of NATO equipment. That's something that the United States didn't agree on. They felt that the F-35, the multi-role fighter jet that Turkey's not only a partner in, it's also a manufacturer and a customer in. They felt that its stealth technology was going to be at risk to the Russians due to the S-400's very sophisticated radar system. That's an issue that's up for debate. Turkey has offered to create a technical working group with U.S. officials to study the relationship between both of these very sophisticated weapons. Americans have declined. And at the end of the day, the United States first withdrew Turkey from the F-35 program. Now, as a punishment, that is understandable. You might not want to put your weapon at risk, and it's understandable. But the United States went even farther and sanctioned Turkey under CATSA, which is Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions and Tariffs Act. And Turkey, the Turkish Defense Industry Secretariat has been under sanctions now, I believe, for a couple months due to this acquisition of the S-400. This is something that Turkey does not understand, because Turkey has given many guarantees to the United States that its weapons wouldn't be under threat and that this is a defensive weapon. This is not an offensive weapon. And why would you sanction a NATO ally when you're trying to counter Russia, supposedly, with this act? Was this act made to counter or legislated to counter Russia and China, or was this act legislated to counter NATO allies or punish NATO allies? And it's not only Turkey that's going to be facing sanctions under this act. It looks like the Indians very, very soon due to their S-400 purchase.
Yeah, they are.
The Egyptians as well due to their purchase of Russian warplanes. And quite possibly Germany or the Nord Stream 2 pipeline might be sanctioned, which is very important for Germany and Europe's energy security as well. So we're seeing this
economic? Like, do you think that this is like the foreign policy aspect is being used as an excuse, and they just don't want people purchasing either the products from China, either the Nord Stream 2 pipeline in regards to this kind of economic boon, or the S-400 missiles? Because it seems like the S-400 missiles is just a good weapon system, and that from the standpoint of, let's say, selling items, be it armaments or the weapon systems, that the U.S., we just don't want other countries purchasing it, meaning we're using a foreign policy as an excuse to get involved in economic choices.
Well, it's definitely economics. And when you look at America's strategy to counter the other two superpowers of the world, whether it be trade wars with China or sanctions on China or sanctions on Russia or Russian assets or Russian military sales, Russian energy sales, they're trying to counter these two superpowers by using economic sanctions as their main instrument, as their main geopolitical instrument to keep that military tension low, but keep the pressure high. We're also seeing the United States do this to Iran as well, especially under the Trump administration when there was a maximum pressure campaign. So definitely economics is very, very important. And when you look at CATSA, it completely goes against the World Trade Organization. It goes against the principles of the capitalist system, which is competition. If you can't compete, you cannot create these superficial boundaries, these superficial restrictions to halt competition. This is unethical. This is against the capitalist mentality, a mentality that the United States has embraced now for over 2 centuries to compete with these countries. If it's not, either create a better anti-air defense system or create better conditions to sell this system. And if you can't, well, someone's doing it better than you. It's not, the United States can't be the best at everything. Obviously, other countries are going to excel at different aspects in different fields in different sectors. So I do believe that this is definitely economic and that America is trying to economically cage in countries that it views that as rivals or could be rivals in the coming years.
Well, it's Yusuf. Thank you for joining us. This is Shane here. I'm curious, kind of spinning from that for a second. We were talking geoeconomics and even geopolitics there, of course. How does Turkey view its neighbors? Who does it see itself allying with here? How does it view within the European Union and the European Union as a bloc? Clearly conflict with the Kurds. Relations with Syria are not exactly in the best state right now. Israel, Russia, Iran, it's more significant neighbors geopolitically and geoeconomically. How does it view them, and how does it view itself in this set of relationships, in this web of relationships tying Europe and Asia together? Yusuf.
Look, when you look at the geopolitical trends right now, whether it be rhetoric coming out of the continent of Europe, strategic autonomy, we hear that buzzword a lot. In Turkey, we hear independent foreign policy a lot. And from a Western perspective, when you hear Turkey say independent foreign policy and you see Turkey centering its foreign policy, it looks as if it's shifting east. It's not. It's taking it into account the multipolar realities of the world. It's not the old world order anymore. It's not the post-Soviet Union order, 30 years of U.S. dominance. That era is coming to an end. Unfortunately, many people in Washington fail to realize this. And the longer they fail to realize this and recalibrate their foreign policy, the tougher it's going to be to have a reset and a rethink going forward. But many countries, whether it be the European continent or Turkey or in the MENA region, are seeing Russia and China growing and are trying to quickly diversify their foreign policy portfolios to create mutual beneficial interests with Beijing and Moscow as well. So this isn't any surprise. And Turkey right now is trying to center itself. It has good relations with Russia. At times, there's a lot of cooperation. At times, there's a lot of competition, because you have to realize that both of these countries project power in many of the same neighborhoods. So bilaterally, everything's very good. But from a foreign policy aspect, when we look at different international theaters, whether it be Syria, Libya, Iraq, Nagorno-Karabakh, Azerbaijan region, these are all areas that Turkey and Russia compete. But that competition is mainly on a proxy level, so it's manageable when it comes to foreign policy. And Putin and Erdogan have a very strong relationship. They spoke with each other just 20 times last year. That's the most bilateral correspondence amongst any two world leaders in the world. So it's understandable that there's strong lines of communications between Ankara and Moscow. Same thing with China. Turkey's trying to increase its relationship with China over the past couple of years as well. Now, this, as I said, this isn't a shift east. Turkey's not reviewing its NATO membership or anything. It's not leaving NATO. These are all things that are ingrained in Turkey's DNA. You don't turn your back on a 7-decade relationship, but that doesn't mean that you don't take into account the changing global realities, which is a multipolar world. And it looks like for the next 5 decades, maybe the next century, it's going to be a multipolar world until something changes. So Turkey is going to continue to center its foreign policy. And many countries are doing this. We're seeing France do this. We're seeing Germany do this. We're seeing much of the European Union do this as well.
I know, absolutely. And like you're saying, there is a sort of tectonic shift in the nature of how countries view their roles and their alliances. And it is towards more independence, by and large. We need to go to a break in a couple of minutes here. You brought up Nagorno-Karabakh. I think it's just like you said that I believe the phrase was that Russia and Turkey were competing. Turkey was backing Azerbaijan. Russia was trying to maintain some degree of independence, from what I can tell. It's not as if they were throwing their lot in with the Armenian side. They were, sort of cautiously trying to work that disagreement out. And it has worked out. It has been worked out. There is now a short but lasting peace between the two countries. I want to turn for a minute to a country that we haven't brought up yet, Ukraine. Like you said, Erdogan and Putin have had a number of meetings, but on the issue of Ukraine, it seems that Erdogan has come down on the side of Zelensky, of the rest of NATO, against Russia. We need to go to a break in a minute here, but briefly, Yusuf, how do you see Ukraine? How do you think Erdogan sees Ukraine? Do you see that as a conflict with Russia? Do you think that's going to get worse? What do you see Turkey's role in Ukraine being, Yusuf?
I think the last thing Erdogan wants to see is any type of kinetic engagement between Ukraine and Russia, and any type of destabilization of that region. The stability of that region is important. Erdogan has very important interests with Zelensky, very important interests with Putin. And the last thing he wants to do is be put in a position where he really needs to choose. Is he on the Ukrainian side? Currently, rhetorically, he is on the Ukrainian side. But would Erdogan back Ukraine militarily against Russia? I highly doubt it. Would Turkey take part in some type of NATO coalition, NATO coalition that has wide participation? That might be an option where Turkey might support Ukraine, but it would only be under the umbrella of NATO. It would not be Turkey and the Ukraine versus Russia in any scenario. I don't see Erdogan putting himself out on a limb, and I don't see him putting Turkey against Russia in that aspect. But as I said, under the umbrella of NATO, with wide participation from NATO member states, yes, Turkey would most likely fulfill its NATO mandate if called upon, and as it has in the past. And as I said before, in Turkey's strategy, it's always engaged Russia militarily only on a proxy level, where it's Russian proxies and Turkish proxies engaging, never direct confrontation. And it would continue that strategy in the Ukraine under the umbrella of NATO.
You know what? We got to go to a break. Thank you for that. We're going to be back with Yusuf in a minute. For those listening, that is the voice of Yusuf Erim, editor-at-large at TRTWorld and Turkish foreign policy expert. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going to a break, but we will be back with Yusuf in just a minute. Be right back.
Fault Lines.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon.
On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines, we divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today, get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the critical hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we continue to be joined by Yusuf Erim. He is, for those listening, the editor-at-large at TRTWorld and Turkish foreign policy expert. Yusuf, thank you again for sticking with us. I want to follow up. We're going to get back into Ukraine here shortly, I'm sure, but on NATO and on Turkey's role in NATO, the largest member nation on that side of the Atlantic in NATO. And like you said, Turkey is simultaneously pursuing more independent foreign policy, as are many other nations in the region and around the world. And yet that inevitably sets them up for some tension between their NATO membership and their own foreign policy agenda. In Syria, the battle lines or the lines of conflict are flexible and vague and sort of shifting enough that hasn't seemed to be an issue. And it is, after all, a proxy conflict. As you said, Turkey is set up to fight with Russia or other nations if NATO decides to throw its lot in on these other conflicts. But it seems like this is setting Turkey up and NATO up for a long-term conflict as individual member states choose to sort of steer their own way militarily and economically. And as Turkey does so too. How do you see that playing out? What do you see Erdogan's role being? And how do you see Turkey's trajectory militarily when it comes to the NATO membership and its own ambitions? Yusuf.
Well, NATO's at a crossroads right now. It's still underneath the Cold War doctrine. It's still being managed as if there was a Cold War, but it needs to take into account the interests and needs of its members. Now, one of the smartest parts of Russian foreign policy, when we look at it, is the way it has engaged NATO members, most namely Germany, France, and Turkey. Now, when we think about NATO, when we think about NATO's military might, you think about 5 countries in reality. You think about the United States and England, and in the EU, France, Germany, and also Turkey. These are the 5 major militaries of NATO. Of course, there's other countries that contribute as well, but none more than these 5. And Moscow's done very smart and very wise foreign policy and been able to engage Germany, France, and Turkey. And by engaging them, they have made them very hesitant on some NATO policies that are directly confronting Russia. And also, like I said, we need to take into account the changing multipolar world right now. France does not want to engage Russia militarily. Neither does Turkey, neither does Germany. So is NATO just an instrument for U.S. and UK foreign policy? If it's not, what should be the new mandate of NATO? And I think that's a discussion that was first raised when Macron, the French president, Emmanuel Macron, called NATO brain dead. And it should have been raised at that summit in December in London at the NATO summit. It wasn't really talked about. So we have to empathize with other countries. Now, from a Russian perspective, you see NATO creeping every year closer and closer to its borders. So obviously, it's going to be a national security threat to the Russians, and this is understandable. This needs to be understood by Washington. So if you're going to contain Russia, if that's your mandate, you have to understand that you need to have this type of containment without heightened tensions. NATO's borders are already very strong. They already contain most of the Baltic states, most of Eastern Europe as well. Adding the Ukraine to NATO, adding Georgia to NATO, having an increased presence in the Black Sea is going to be viewed as a national security threat. It's only going to escalate tensions. And of course, NATO needs to take into account migration from the Middle East, especially with this destabilization in Syria, Iraq, and possible destabilization in the future, and the security in the Eastern Mediterranean. These are all new threats that were not thought about when NATO was being formed, but NATO needs to evolve with the changing geopolitical needs. Now, as for Turkey's military, Turkey's continuing to localize its manufacturing. Now, I believe Turkey's local manufacturing meets about 70% of Turkey's military needs now, when compared to about 25% a decade or two ago. And I think the capacity of Turkish drones now is very well known, what they've done in Nagorno-Karabakh, Libya, and Syria. I don't think I need to go over that. And Turkey's continuing to invest in its local manufacturing because it wants to wean off its dependency on foreign weapons. I don't think it trusts foreign countries to be able to buy weapons from them and have a continuation of supply of spare parts as well. We've seen Canada stop selling the optics for some of these drones, but it didn't really bother Turkey because Turkey during this time was able to prepare its own optics for its drones as well. And it's going to continue. It's going to continue to project its power in North Africa. It's going to continue to project its power in the Middle East. And it's going to continue all these policies regardless of what's going on with NATO.
That's the interesting question. And because you clearly understand, like, this notion that NATO is encroaching closer and closer on Russian borders. And in the context of that, any country would take issue with encroachment on their borders, especially if you have an organization that was set, that supposedly for the Soviet Union goes bust, and the organization stays and continues to creep on the borders. I mean, it just comes across as this is a tool for geopolitical, I don't know what you want to call it, adventurism of sorts, as opposed to a tool of defense. And, you know, like you said, this gets kind of worse the more that you add on to it. And if you're going to make the argument that we're going to continue to gobble up countries, and if any of those countries are attacked, all of those countries respond, but we're also going to get closer and closer to the border of Russia as we do that. That is greatly problematic. I mean, do you see NATO as
you know
just
what that's going to do?
Go for it.
It's going to fracture the world into an East and West camp. When you have this type of military buildup from the West, every action has a counter reaction. And the counter reaction to this type of military buildup in the West is going to be a military buildup in the East. And we're slowly seeing more and more Eastern organizations being formed. Shanghai Cooperation Council, ASEAN, and other types of organizations. While most of these organizations right now are economic cooperation, that doesn't mean in the future these economic cooperation cannot expand to include military cooperation as well. So this type of buildup is just going to create a backlash. And we've seen this throughout history. And I think the last thing the world needs right now is an Eastern Bloc versus a Western Bloc. Because now with the rise of China, this won't look like the Cold War. This will be like the Cold War on steroids.
Yeah.
Because you're going to have a Sino-Russian coalition. A multitude of countries are going to join them. You have the yuan becoming a very predominant currency in the world. Probably in the next 10 to 20 years, it's going to be globally accepted just as much as the U.S. dollar. Yeah. So you're going to have these currency wars. You're not going to have a U.S. dollar-dominated system. You're going to have Russian weapons proliferated throughout the East. So you're going to have something that looks like an Eastern version of NATO if this type of aggression and if this type of raising of tensions continues.
Where does Turkey fall on that?
The engagement.
Where's Turkey?
Yeah, what's Turkey's disposition there?
Yeah, where's Turkey in that? I'm fascinated by that because right now
that would put Turkey in a very precarious place. And I don't know what Turkey's position would be because what I was just saying is 10 to 20 years down the line, and Turkey right now is in a very, very slippery neighborhood. When I mean slippery neighborhood, the geopolitics of this region are changing so quickly. I mean, 10 years ago, could anyone imagine Turkey and Russia cooperating on this level? No. Could anyone imagine Turkey having serious problems with NATO? No. Can anyone imagine Turkey launching expeditionary forces 2,000 kilometers away? They didn't have that capacity, but now they have that capacity in Libya. So a lot has changed over the last 10 years, and I'm sure a lot more is going to change over the next 10 years. So it's really foggy to be able to call what's going to happen a decade down the line.
Well, we only have a couple minutes here. I want to get to Turkey's state going forward, and I'm speaking economically. The value of the Turkish lira is, at least in the second lira, at all-time lows, with the exchange rate compared to the American dollar having dropped like something from every 8 Turkish liras would be equivalent to 10 American dollars. pardon me, the other way around. Every 12, something like 12, 13 Turkish liras equivalent to 10 American dollars. Absolute shambles. A 0.83 exchange rate effectively over the last 13 years, dropping down to a 0.12, 0.13. The number jumps around every once in a while, but at least in terms of the state of that currency, which is reflective on a deeper level of the state of the economy, things aren't going well. What's Erdogan's position on that? How do you see the Turkish economy changing? What do you see that being caused by, and what could potentially fix that from the Turkish side? Yusuf.
That's a lot of questions there. Let's start with what caused it. Well, first of all, obviously, COVID's had a huge impact on all the global economies. Over the last 3 years, Turkey's been sanctioned twice by the United States. Both have resulted in serious foreign currency hikes. I believe during the sanctions for Pastor Brunson, which was, I believe, 2018 August, the Turkish lira was at 8.5 Turkish liras to a dollar. It had recovered all the way back to 6.9 Turkish liras to a dollar up to like 2 months ago. The central bank governor got sacked, and the previous central bank governor was very well liked by the market. So they didn't take too kindly upon the new appointment. So that created an influx. And also, again, with the CATSA sanctions, that created another sell-off in the Turkish lira as well. So when we look at the economic indicators of Turkey, they're not that bad. They don't warrant such a weak Turkish lira. Obviously, the weak Turkish lira does have some benefits to exports. It's much easier for Turkey to export its goods because of its currency is very soft right now. But of course, then you have price stability problems.
1 minute.
Inflation, which isn't good, which affects much of the population. And the economy, which has always been Erdogan's strong suit before elections, is right now his weak underbelly. So it's definitely a priority for Erdogan to get the economy back. And he's been preparing some economic reform packages, and he does want to get the economy back on track before elections in 2023. So you have elections down the road about 1.5 to 2 years from now. And that's something that he's definitely keyed on.
30.
Definitely right now is top priority, getting the economy going. But also, obviously, solving the COVID problem is very, very important, because you can't get the economy going when the country's under lockdown as well. So
absolutely.
It's kind of
I hear you. No,
right now.
It is. No, and a lot of countries are facing that, of course. Yusuf, thank you for joining us. Great conversation. Really appreciate you being with us. Yusuf Erim, editor-at-large at TRTWorld and Turkish foreign policy expert. You're listening to Fault Lines. We'll be back in a minute with headlines and another 2 hours this morning. Be right back.